Tonight, we're stepping back into the age of the Abbasids, one of the most powerful and influential dynasties in Islamic history. Not the quick summary you might have heard before, but the full, rich story of a world where faith, politics, and knowledge transformed civilizations. You might think you know the Abbasids, but trust me, the depth of their legacy will surprise you. If you're enjoying these journeys through history, a quick like or subscribe goes a long way in helping this channel grow. And I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment with your location and the time right now. It's incredible to see how this global community connects through our shared love of history. So settle in, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself a cup of tea, and join me. Because tonight we're walking through the palaces of Baghdad, the learning halls of Cairo, and the courts of Cordoba, right at the height of the Abbasid Caliphate. Chapter 1: The End of the Umayyads and the Rise of the Abbasid Cause. Imagine the scene. The year is 744 C. The mighty Umayyad Caliphate, once stretching from Spain in the west to Central Asia in the east, is showing signs of weakness. For nearly a century, the Umayyads had ruled the Muslim world, building cities, expanding frontiers, and establishing an empire that rivaled Rome in its size and scope. But beneath the surface, resentment was growing, and soon, that discontent would explode. The Umayyads had achieved incredible expansion. Damascus was their capital, and from there, they ruled over a diverse empire of Arabs, Persians, Berbers, Turks, and countless other peoples. Yet, their style of rule carried heavy criticism. Many Muslims felt that the Umayyads had turned the caliphate into a hereditary monarchy, something far removed from the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs. Worse still, their emphasis on Arab supremacy created deep divisions. Non-Arab Muslims, Persians in particular, often felt like second-class citizens. They were called Mawli and faced heavier taxation and fewer privileges compared to Arab Muslims. Over time, this bred discontent, especially in the eastern provinces where Persians made up a large portion of the population. Meanwhile, pious Muslims across the empire criticized the Umayyads for worldliness and corruption. Stories spread of caliphs who lived in luxury while ignoring the principles of justice and equality. This wasn't true for every Umayyad, but the perception was enough to weaken their legitimacy. And in the shadows, a new movement was forming. Whoa! I know you want to keep watching, but please hit that like button. Your support helps me keep creating more of this content and sharing it with even more people. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. May Allah bless you all for your support. The Abbasid family, descendants of Al-Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib, the uncle of the Prophet, began positioning themselves as the true heirs of Islam. By claiming descent from the Prophet's family, the Abbasids built a powerful image. They were not only relatives of the Messenger, but they also represented a more inclusive vision of the Caliphate. Their promise was simple: an empire that belonged to all Muslims, Arabs and non-Arabs alike. This message spread like wildfire, especially in Khorasan, a region in northeastern Iran and Central Asia. Khorasan was far from the Umayyad capital in Damascus, and it was home to many Persians who felt alienated. It was also home to Arab settlers who had grown distant from the Umayyad elite. Together, these communities became fertile ground for revolution. The Abbasids' movement was secret at first, carried out by underground agents who spread propaganda and organized cells of supporters. These agents spoke of justice, equality, and a new era under the family of the Prophet. They used the symbol of black banners to represent their cause, contrasting with the Umayyads' white banners. And at the center of this brewing storm stood one man, Abu Muslim al-Khurasani. Abu Muslim was a brilliant strategist, a master of organization, and above all, a skilled revolutionary. He became the driving force of the Abbasid Revolution. With his charisma and determination, he united Persians, Arabs, and disaffected Muslims under a single banner. By 747 CE, the revolution had begun. The black banners were raised in Khorasan, and Abbasid armies began marching westward. They gained momentum quickly, defeating Umayyad forces in several battles. The Abbasids' message of equality resonated everywhere they went, and soon, entire regions declared their support. The Umayyads tried to resist, but their empire was collapsing under the weight of its own divisions. In 750 CE, the two sides met in one of the most decisive battles in Islamic history, the Battle of the Great Sab. The Umayyad army was crushed. Thousands were killed, and the survivors scattered. The Abbasids marched triumphantly into Kufa, declaring the dawn of a new era. The first Abbasid Caliph, Abu al-Abbas al-Safa, was proclaimed. His title, al-Safa, means the bloodshedder, a sign of the vengeance the Abbasids carried against the Umayyads. Indeed, the Abbasids set out to eliminate their rivals completely. Umayyad princes were hunted down and executed. The dynasty that had once ruled the Muslim world was wiped out, except for one survivor, Abd al-Rahman, who fled all the way to Spain and established the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba. But in the east, their rule was finished. The Abbasids had risen from the shadows to topple one of the greatest dynasties in history. Yet their story was only beginning. Chapter 2: The Abbasid Revolution and the Black Banners of Khorasan. Picture the vast lands of Khorasan in the mid-8th century. A rugged region of mountains and fertile valleys, far from the Umayyad capital of Damascus. Here, on the edges of the empire, where Persians, Arabs, Turks, and countless others lived side by side, a storm was brewing. A storm that would sweep across the Muslim world and change history forever. The Abbasid cause did not begin with armies, it began with whispers. Agents of the Abbasid family traveled in secret, moving from town to town, spreading their message. They promised an empire that would return to the principles of Islam, an empire not dominated by Arab privilege, but one where Persians, Turks, and other non-Arabs, the Mawali, would finally be treated as equals. They claimed legitimacy through al-Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib, the uncle of the Prophet. That family connection carried enormous weight, for in the hearts of many Muslims, the family of the Prophet held a sacred place. This connection gave the Abbasids something the Umayyads lacked, a sense of religious authenticity. The Abbasids' movement was called the Dawah, meaning the call. It spread quietly, especially in the eastern provinces. And at the heart of it all was the figure who would turn whispers into revolution, Abu Muslim al-Khurasani. Abu Muslim remains one of history's most mysterious characters. Some sources describe him as a Persian of humble origins, others as a freed slave who rose through sheer brilliance. What is certain is his charisma, his organizational genius, and his ability to unite people who, under normal circumstances, would have been rivals. Arabs and Persians, Sunnis and Shiite, tribes and townsmen, Abu Muslim brought them together under a single banner. And that banner was black. The Abbasids chose black as their symbol, in contrast to the Umayyads' white banners. When black flags appeared on the horizon, people knew the Abbasids were near. To supporters, the black symbolized justice, vengeance, and a new dawn. To the Umayyads, it was the color of rebellion and death. In the year 747 CE, Abu Muslim made his move. In the city of Merv, deep in Khorasan, the Abbasid call became an armed uprising. The black banners were raised, and with them, the hopes of countless Muslims who had grown weary of Umayyad rule. The revolution spread like wildfire. One by one, towns and garrisons declared their support for the Abbasids. The Umayyad governors tried to resist, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer momentum of the uprising. Abu Muslim's forces marched westward, disciplined, and determined. The Abbasids also had something the Umayyads could not match, a message that appealed to almost everyone. To Persians, they promised equality. To the pious, they promised justice and a return to Islamic values. To the Shura, they promised rule by the Prophet's family. To the Arab settlers in Khorasan, they promised recognition and power. It was a coalition too broad to resist. By 749, the Abbasid army had crossed into Iraq. The revolution was no longer a regional rebellion. It was a full-scale takeover. The Umayyads scrambled to defend their position, but divisions within their own ranks weakened them. Many tribes who had once supported the Umayyads now switched allegiance, sensing the tide of history turning. Finally, in January of 750, the decisive confrontation arrived. At the Battle of the Great Zab River in northern Iraq, the Abbasid army met the forces of the Umayyad Caliph Marwan II. The battle was fierce, but it ended in disaster for the Umayyads. Marwan's troops, exhausted and demoralized, were crushed by Abu Muslim's disciplined forces. The Umayyads broke and fled, leaving behind a battlefield littered with the dead. The Great Zab marked not just a military defeat, but the end of an era. The Abbasids marched into Kufa as victors. There, they proclaimed the first Abbasid Caliph, Abu al-Abbas al-Safa. His very title, al-Safa, the bloodshedder, signaled what was to come. The Abbasids set about eliminating their rivals, determined to erase the Umayyad line forever. At a banquet in Kufa, Umayyad princes were invited under the pretense of reconciliation. Once inside, Abbasid guards fell upon them, slaughtering most of the family in a single night. It was a brutal but calculated act. The Abbasids wanted no challengers to their throne. Only one Umayyad, Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiyah, managed to escape, fleeing across North Africa and eventually reaching Al-Andalus, where he established the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba. But in the east, the Umayyads were finished. The Abbasids had won. The revolution was complete. A new dynasty, claiming both religious legitimacy and popular support, now ruled the Muslim world. But while the Abbasid rise had been swift and bloody, the real challenge was only beginning. It is one thing to win power. It is another to govern a vast and diverse empire. The Abbasids had toppled the Umayyads. Now, they had to prove they could rule better. Tonight, we're moving deeper into the Abbasid story, from revolution to consolidation. The black banners have been raised, the Umayyads have fallen, and now the Abbasids face the real test, ruling a vast empire. This is the story of the first Abbasid caliphs, men who had to transform rebellion into governance, and in doing so, lay the foundations of one of history's greatest dynasties. So settle in, because you're about to see how the Abbasids turned victory into empire. The Abbasid dynasty began with Abu al-Abbas al-Safa, the first caliph. His rule was short, just 4 years, from 750 to 754 C, but it was decisive. Known as al-Safa, the bloodshedder, his reign was marked by the ruthless elimination of Umayyad loyalists. For the Abbasids, this wasn't mere cruelty, it was survival. The dynasty needed to establish itself as unchallenged. Al-Safa's rule also marked a symbolic shift in the empire. The Abbasids moved their political center from Damascus to Iraq, closer to Persia and the eastern provinces that had supported their revolution. The old Syrian base of the Umayyads was abandoned. A new age had begun. But it was under his brother and successor, Al-Mansur, that the Abbasids truly began to define their state. Al-Mansur ruled from 754 to 775 C, and he was one of the most significant builders of the dynasty. Al-Mansur was shrewd, calculating, and often ruthless. He understood that the Abbasids could not survive on revolutionary momentum alone. They needed a stable system of administration, a strong capital, and firm control over their diverse territories. Baghdad grew rapidly, becoming not just a political capital, but a cultural and economic hub. Traders, scholars, and artisans flocked to the city. Within a century, it would become the beating heart of the Islamic world, a city whose very name would symbolize wealth, learning, and power. But Al-Mansur's reign was not just about city building. He also had to put down revolts. Several Shura groups, who had initially supported the Abbasid revolution under the hope of rule by the Prophet's descendants, felt betrayed when the Abbasids took power for themselves. Revolts erupted, most famously under Muhammad al-Nafs al-Zakiyya, a descendant of Imam Hassan. Al-Mansur crushed these rebellions mercilessly, ensuring Abbasid control but also deepening tensions with Shura communities. Al-Mansur also consolidated the bureaucracy. He relied heavily on Persian administrators, who brought with them centuries of experience in governance from the Sasanian Empire. This Persian influence became a hallmark of Abbasid rule, blending Arab Islamic leadership with Persian political traditions. Under his leadership, the Caliphate became more than an Arab empire. It was now a cosmopolitan state, incorporating the talents of Persians, Arabs, Turks, and others. By the time of his death in 775, Al-Mansur had secured the dynasty's survival and laid the groundwork for the Abbasid Golden Age. His successors would build on his foundation, but none of it would have been possible without his foresight. The Abbasids had started as revolutionaries under al-Safa. Under Al-Mansur, they became rulers, masters of an empire that was beginning to stretch its influence across the known world. It was the year 762 CE, and the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mansur had decided it was time for a new beginning. The old Umayyad capital, Damascus, was too closely tied to the dynasty they had overthrown. Even Kufa, where the Abbasid revolution had first declared victory, was not suited for the grand vision Al-Mansur had in mind. He wanted a city that was not just a political capital, but a symbol, a statement of Abbasid power, unity, and ambition. After careful consideration, he chose a site along the Tigris River, near the old Persian capital of Ctesiphon. The location was strategic. Fertile lands surrounded it, trade routes passed through it, and the river provided easy transport. It was close enough to Persia to embrace its rich traditions, yet still rooted in the Arab heartland of Iraq. The design of the city was revolutionary. Baghdad would be built as a perfect circle, a city unlike any other in the world. At its center stood the Caliph's palace, the Golden Gate Palace, with its gleaming dome and towering presence. Beside it rose the Great Mosque, symbolizing the unity of political and religious authority. From the center, wide avenues stretched outward like spokes on a wheel, leading to massive gates that opened in each direction. The Khorasan Gate toward Persia and Central Asia, the Basra Gate toward the Arabian Gulf, the Kufa Gate toward the Arabian Peninsula, the Sham Gate toward Syria and the Mediterranean. This layout was no accident. It reflected Al-Mansur's vision, Baghdad as the hub of the world, with all roads leading back to the Caliph. Within a century of its founding, Baghdad was said to have housed nearly 1 million people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Its bazaars bustled day and night, its scholars debated in mosques and libraries, and its poets recited verses in candlelit gatherings. For the Abbasids, Baghdad was more than a city, it was a symbol of their dominance. Just as Rome had embodied the power of the Caesars, Baghdad now embodied the glory of the Abbasids. But greatness always comes with challenges. The wealth of Baghdad would attract not only merchants and scholars, but also rivals, rebels, and invaders. For now, though, in the time of Al-Mansur and his successors, Baghdad shone like a jewel, the crown of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the beating heart of the Islamic world. Chapter 5: Harun al-Rashid and the Height of Splendor. When people think of the Abbasid Caliphate, one name rises above nearly all others: Harun al-Rashid. His reign, from 786 to 809 CE, is often remembered as the golden peak of Abbasid power and culture. Under Harun, Baghdad reached a level of splendor that dazzled the world. Stories of his court would later inspire the legendary tales of 1001 Nights, blending history and myth into timeless fables of wealth, wisdom, and wonder. But behind the legends lies a man who presided over one of the most influential reigns in Islamic history. Harun al-Rashid inherited an empire that stretched from North Africa to Central Asia. It was vast, diverse, and sometimes unstable, but it was also incredibly wealthy. Trade routes connected Baghdad to China, India, Africa, and Europe. Gold flowed into the city, along with silk, spices, glass, perfumes, and books. The Caliph himself became a symbol of this wealth. His palace in Baghdad, known as the Qasr al-Khuld, was said to be filled with marble halls, jeweled furnishings, and gardens where fountains splashed and exotic birds sang. Ambassadors from Byzantium and Europe marveled at the riches of his court. One famous story tells of Harun sending a gift to Charlemagne, the Frankish king in Europe. Among the treasures was a magnificent clock that struck the hours with mechanical figures. When Charlemagne's court saw it, they thought it was magic. In reality, it was a glimpse of the Abbasids' mastery of engineering. But Harun was not just a lover of luxury, he was also a patron of knowledge. Scholars, poets, and musicians thrived under his rule. The seeds planted by Al-Mansur in Baghdad were now flourishing. Study circles expanded, translations of ancient works continued, and the caliph's support gave legitimacy to the pursuit of learning. Harun's reign also saw the rise of the Barmakids, a powerful family of Persian origin who served as viziers, or chief ministers. The Barmakids were skilled administrators and patrons of science and culture themselves. Under their guidance, the Abbasid bureaucracy became more efficient, and Baghdad's intellectual life blossomed even further. But Harun's reign was not without challenges. The empire was vast, and maintaining unity was difficult. Revolts broke out in the provinces, and rival groups sometimes questioned Abbasid authority. Harun often had to rely on military campaigns to keep order. Still, his leadership kept the empire strong, and his name became synonymous with prosperity. Even the way he is remembered in folklore, walking the streets of Baghdad in disguise to hear the concerns of his people, reflects the aura of justice and care that surrounded his rule, whether or not the tales are strictly true. By the end of Harun al-Rashid's reign, the Abbasid Caliphate stood at its zenith. Baghdad was the wealthiest city on earth. Its markets overflowed with goods, its libraries filled with books, and its mosques echoed with the voices of scholars. To travelers, it seemed like the very center of civilization. Yet beneath the glittering surface, tensions were beginning to grow. The wealth of the empire was immense, but so were the costs of maintaining it. The Barmakids, once indispensable, would eventually fall from favor in a dramatic purge. And after Harun's death, the succession would plunge the Abbasids into civil war. For now, though, Harun al-Rashid's reign shines as a golden moment, a time when Baghdad was the jewel of the world, and the Abbasid Caliphate stood at the height of its glory. Chapter 6: The House of Wisdom and the Golden Age of Knowledge. If Harun al-Rashid gave Baghdad its aura of wealth and prestige, it was his son, Al-Mamun, who transformed it into the unrivaled center of learning. His reign, from 813 to 833 CE, came after a brutal civil war with his brother Al-Amin. The conflict had left Baghdad scarred, but once Al-Mamun secured power, he turned his attention toward knowledge, philosophy, and science. At the heart of this intellectual explosion stood one institution above all others, Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. The House of Wisdom was not just a library, though its shelves were filled with manuscripts from across the known world. It was also a translation bureau, an academy, and a research center. Al-Ma'mun poured resources into it, sending emissaries as far as Byzantium and India to acquire rare texts. Ancient Greek works of philosophy and medicine, Persian treatises on astronomy, Indian texts on mathematics, all of these found their way into Arabic through the efforts of scholars in Baghdad. One of the most influential translators was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Nestorian Christian who mastered Greek, Syriac, and Arabic. He and his team rendered the works of Hippocrates, Galen, Aristotle, and Plato into Arabic, making their ideas accessible to the Islamic world. These translations did not just preserve knowledge, they transformed it. Muslim scholars went beyond merely copying the ancients. They criticized, expanded, and refined what they read. In mathematics, for instance, figures like Al-Khwarizmi revolutionized the field. His works on algebra, a word derived from his book Al-Jabr, laid the foundation for modern mathematics. He also introduced Hindu-Arabic numerals, including the concept of zero, which would later spread to Europe and change the way the world calculated. In astronomy, scholars built observatories to chart the stars with unprecedented accuracy. Al-Ma'mun himself was deeply interested in the subject. He commissioned measurements of the Earth's circumference, coming remarkably close to the modern figure. Medicine flourished as well. The works of Galen and Hippocrates were studied, but physicians like Al-Razi and later Ibn Sina developed original medical texts that would dominate both the Islamic and European worlds for centuries. Hospitals in Baghdad and other cities were not only places of healing, but also centers of training for medical students. Philosophy, too, found a new home in the Abbasid world. Thinkers such as Al-Kindi and later Al-Farabi sought to harmonize Greek philosophy with Islamic thought. They asked bold questions about reason, revelation, the nature of the soul, and the structure of the universe. These debates sometimes stirred controversy, but they also enriched Islamic intellectual life. The House of Wisdom embodied the cosmopolitan spirit of the Abbasid era. Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Persian scholars worked side by side, united in their pursuit of knowledge. In Baghdad, truth was sought not just for its own sake, but as a way to glorify God and understand His creation. What made this moment so extraordinary was the Abbasids' openness to learning from every corner of the world. Where other empires had destroyed libraries, the Abbasids collected them. Where others feared foreign ideas, the Abbasids absorbed and transformed them. This intellectual generosity created a culture where curiosity thrived. The effects rippled outward. From Baghdad, knowledge spread to other great cities like Cairo, Cordoba, and Damascus. And centuries later, when Europe was emerging from the so-called Dark Ages, it would be through Arabic translations of Greek works, preserved and enhanced by Abbasid scholars, that the Renaissance would ignite. In the time of Al-Ma'mun and the House of Wisdom, Baghdad was more than just the political capital of an empire. It was the beating heart of world civilization, where knowledge was as treasured as gold, and the pursuit of wisdom was seen as an act of devotion. This was the true golden age of the Abbasids, a moment when the love of learning lit up the world. Chapter 7: Daily Life in Abbasid Baghdad. When we think of the Abbasid Caliphate, it's easy to picture caliphs in jeweled palaces or scholars debating in libraries. But what about the ordinary people, the merchants, artisans, travelers, and families who filled the streets of Baghdad? To truly understand this era, we need to step into their world. By the 9th century, Baghdad had become one of the largest cities on earth. Estimates suggest its population may have reached 1 million people, a staggering figure for the medieval world. The city was carefully planned, At its center lay the famous round city, built by Al-Mansur, with the Caliph's palace and grand mosque at its heart. Around it spread neighborhoods filled with homes, markets, and workshops. Walking through Baghdad meant stepping into a city alive with sound, color, and movement. The souks, or marketplaces, stretched for miles, each quarter specializing in certain goods. In one district, the air was thick with the smell of spices, cinnamon, cardamom, pepper, and saffron brought from India and beyond. In another, merchants displayed silks and brocades, dyed in brilliant colors that dazzled the eye. Artisans worked in every trade imaginable. Blacksmiths hammered iron tools, glassmakers shaped delicate bottles, leatherworkers stitched saddles, and jewelers set precious stones into gold. Baghdad's markets were not just places of commerce, but centers of innovation and craftsmanship. And then there was the book market, a unique feature of Abbasid life. Booksellers lined the streets, offering manuscripts copied by skilled scribes. Students, poets, and scholars crowded the stalls, debating ideas and comparing texts. Knowledge in Baghdad wasn't hidden away. It was part of the public sphere. Daily life varied greatly depending on one's class and occupation. Wealthy families lived in spacious houses with courtyards and gardens. Their meals might include lamb, chicken, rice dishes flavored with herbs, and sweet desserts like dates and honey pastries. Music and poetry were common entertainments, and hosting salons for intellectual discussion was a mark of prestige. For the poor, life was far humbler. Many lived in cramped quarters, worked long hours, and relied on simple foods like bread, lentils, and vegetables. Yet even for them, Baghdad offered opportunities. The bustling economy meant work could be found in trade, construction, or service. Charity, an important principle in Islam, also provided support. Mosques distributed food and alms to those in need. Religion was woven into the rhythm of daily life. The call to prayer echoed across the city 5 times a day, summoning people from all walks of life to pause and turn toward God. Fridays, the day of communal prayer, brought crowds to the mosques, where sermons addressed both spiritual and social matters. But Baghdad was not only Muslim. Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and others lived in the city, contributing to its culture and economy. Protected as dhimmis under Islamic law, they paid a special tax but were allowed to practice their faith and often rose to prominence as doctors, translators, and officials. This diversity gave the city a cosmopolitan character unmatched anywhere else in the world. Education was deeply valued. Children from wealthier families studied grammar, poetry, Quran, and law under private tutors, while many others learned in maktabs, small neighborhood schools often attached to mosques. Young boys and, in some cases, girls were taught to read and write, a remarkable emphasis on literacy for the time. Entertainment filled the evenings. Storytellers recited epics in coffee houses and public squares. Musicians played the oud, flutes, and drums. Poets competed in verse, weaving lines that could make or break reputations. Even games like chess, imported from India, became beloved pastimes, reflecting both strategy and intellect. Of course, life in Baghdad also had its hardships. Fires and floods sometimes struck the city. Disease could spread quickly in crowded quarters. And political unrest occasionally brought violence into the streets. Yet despite these challenges, the city endured and thrived, constantly drawing newcomers who dreamed of fortune and knowledge. To walk in Abbasid Baghdad was to witness a world at its height, a place where faith and reason coexisted, where merchants bargained over silks while scholars debated Aristotle, where the call to prayer mingled with the laughter of children in the courtyards. This was not just the capital of a caliphate. To many, Baghdad was the center of the world, a symbol of what human civilization could achieve when commerce, culture, and knowledge flourished side by side. Chapter 8: The Spread of Abbasid Influence to Cordoba, Cairo, and beyond. The Abbasid Caliphate was centered in Baghdad, but its influence did not stop at the city's walls, or even at the empire's borders. Ideas, styles, and systems born under Abbasid rule radiated outward, shaping lands as far as Spain in the west and India in the east. To understand their true legacy, we have to see how their world touched others. One of the most remarkable stories of this influence is found in Al-Andalus, or Muslim Spain. In 750 CE, when the Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads, one surviving prince escaped the massacre, Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiyah. After a long flight, he crossed into Iberia and eventually established the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba. Though politically independent from Baghdad, Cordoba still drew inspiration from the Abbasid model. The city blossomed into a beacon of learning, art, and architecture. By the 10th century, Cordoba rivaled Baghdad itself. Its libraries contained hundreds of thousands of books, its streets were lit with oil lamps, and its mosques echoed with scholars' debates. The Abbasid emphasis on knowledge and culture found a second home here, laying the foundation for Europe's later Renaissance. Further east, in North Africa, Abbasid governors and local dynasties carried their influence. The city of Cairo in Tunisia became a center of Islamic scholarship, producing jurists and theologians who shaped Islamic law. Trade routes across the Sahara brought gold, salt, and ivory to the Abbasid markets, enriching Baghdad while spreading Islamic culture into West Africa. In Egypt, the city of Fustat, and later Cairo, grew into hubs of commerce and learning. Though Egypt would eventually be ruled by the Fatimids, the Abbasid presence left a deep imprint, particularly in the establishment of institutions that fused governance with religious and scholarly life. The flourishing of universities and mosques in Egypt owed much to Abbasid precedents. To the east, the Abbasid influence extended into Persia and Central Asia. Cities like Nishapur, Merv, and Samarkand thrived under Abbasid governors and local dynasties loyal to the caliphs. These regions became crossroads of trade and scholarship. Persian culture, in particular, blended seamlessly with Abbasid life, from administration and literature to philosophy and art. The poetry of figures like Rumi's predecessors and the refinement of Persian storytelling would later inspire the Islamic world for centuries. Even in India, Abbasid influence seeped in. Through both trade and the spread of Islam, Abbasid ideals of governance, scholarship, and art took root in the subcontinent. Merchants carried not just goods, but also books, languages, and customs. Small communities of Muslims in coastal India looked to Baghdad for spiritual and legal guidance, tying distant lands into the orbit of the Caliphate. One of the most powerful channels of Abbasid influence was, of course, trade. Baghdad sat at the center of global networks. Caravans from Central Asia brought silk and horses, ships from India carried spices and gems, traders from East Africa offered ivory and gold, and merchants from Europe came seeking luxury goods. Alongside material wealth, these networks carried ideas, scientific theories, philosophical texts, religious debates, and artistic styles. Another channel was religion and law. The Abbasids saw themselves not just as rulers, but as guardians of Islam. Their support of scholars in developing Islamic jurisprudence, the schools of law, provided a framework that spread across the entire Muslim world. Whether in Cordoba, Cairo, Cairo, or Samarkand, Muslims studied the same great jurists and debated the same questions of law and ethics, creating a shared intellectual tradition. Even architecture carried Abbasid marks. The pointed arches, domes, and courtyards that defined mosques across the Muslim world often traced their roots to Abbasid designs. From the Great Mosque of Samarra to the Mezquita of Cordoba, the artistic language of the Abbasids left a lasting imprint. What's striking is that even when political unity fractured, when Cordoba broke away, when Egypt leaned toward its own dynasties, when Central Asia developed semi-independent rulers, the cultural unity endured. The Abbasid ethos of combining faith, governance, and knowledge continued to inspire. By the 10th century, the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad no longer wielded absolute political power over these distant regions. But his spiritual and cultural authority still carried weight. Letters, gifts, and coins bearing the caliph's name traveled across continents. For many Muslims, acknowledging the caliph in Baghdad gave legitimacy, even when real power lay elsewhere. In this way, the Abbasids were not merely rulers of a single empire. They were the spiritual and cultural axis of a far broader world, a world where Cordoba shone in Spain, Cairo rose in Egypt, merchants crossed the Sahara into Africa, and caravans carried knowledge into China. The Abbasid story, then, is not just about Baghdad. It is about a network of civilizations tied together by trade, faith, and learning, with Baghdad as the beating heart. And that heartbeat could be felt from the shores of the Atlantic to the mountains of Central Asia. Chapter 9: The Splendor of Abbasid Art, Architecture, and Literature. When we think of the Abbasids, our minds often turn first to their power and politics. But just as important, perhaps even more enduring, was their contribution to culture, art, and literature. Under their rule, Islamic civilization flourished in a way that blended the spiritual with the beautiful, the intellectual with the imaginative. The Abbasids inherited traditions from the Arabs, Persians, Byzantines, and beyond, and out of this mosaic, they created something distinctly their own. Baghdad, Samarra, and the cities under their influence became centers where architecture, calligraphy, poetry, and storytelling thrived. To walk through an Abbasid city was to feel a civilization at its artistic height. Architecture, palaces, mosques, and cities. Perhaps the most striking testament to Abbasid creativity was their architecture. When the Abbasids built Baghdad, they envisioned not just a capital, but a symbol. The round city was a marvel of urban design, perfectly circular, with the caliph's palace and mosque at its very center. This design reflected an idea: all life revolved around the caliphate, around Islam itself. Though much of the round city has been lost to time, its vision still speaks of grandeur. Later, the Abbasids constructed Samarra, which briefly became the capital in the 9th century. Here, one of the most iconic monuments of Islamic architecture still stands: the Great Mosque of Samarra with its massive spiral minaret, rising into the sky like a winding staircase to the heavens. This was not merely a place of prayer, it was a statement of power, of creativity, of a civilization unafraid to experiment with form and scale. The Abbasid era also saw mosques across the empire adopting new features: wide courtyards, shaded arcades, domed prayer halls, and soaring minarets. The architecture carried messages: unity, openness, and the centrality of community life in Islam. These designs influenced mosques from Morocco to India. Calligraphy and ornament. In a world where Islam discouraged lifelike depictions of humans and animals in sacred spaces, the Abbasids turned writing itself into art. Calligraphy became the highest form of decoration, and the Quran was copied with exquisite care. The Kufic script, bold and angular, dominated early manuscripts and mosque walls. Later, more fluid styles developed, adorning everything from palaces to everyday objects. Geometric patterns and arabesques filled the spaces in between. These endless, interlacing designs symbolize the infinite nature of God's creation: order within complexity, beauty without bounds. To enter an Abbasid mosque or palace was to see a universe written in stone, tile, and wood. Literature, the birth of a tradition. If Abbasid architecture expressed beauty in stone, their literature captured it in words. Under their patronage, Arabic literature reached dazzling heights. Poetry, already central to Arab culture, evolved into new forms, exploring not only themes of love and war, but also philosophy, theology, and the human condition. Perhaps the most famous product of this era was the collection of stories we know today as The 1001 Nights. Though its tales drew on Persian, Indian, and Arabic traditions, it was in Abbasid Baghdad that they took their classic form. Stories of Sinbad the Sailor, Aladdin, and Ali Baba may be partly legendary, but they reflect the atmosphere of a world buzzing with trade, discovery, and wonder. The Abbasid court also became a stage for poets. Figures like Ibn Uwas wrote verses of sharp wit and bold themes, while others like Al-Mutanabi embodied the power of Arabic expression, weaving pride, wisdom, and philosophy into their lines. These poets were not mere entertainers. They shaped the Arabic language into a tool of both elegance and depth. Historians and storytellers. The Abbasids also fostered the writing of history. Chroniclers such as Al-Tabari compiled vast accounts of earlier times, blending fact with narrative, faith with politics. Their works preserved not only Islamic history, but also the traditions of earlier civilizations. These texts became references for generations, keeping alive the memory of past empires and the lessons of their rise and fall. At the same time, storytellers thrived in the streets and markets. Ordinary people heard tales of heroes, prophets, and adventures told aloud, often in coffee houses or public gatherings. Literature in the Abbasid age was not confined to the elite, it was a living, breathing part of daily life. The fusion of cultures. What made Abbasid art and literature so unique was their ability to fuse influences. Persian epic traditions blended with Arabic poetry. Greek philosophical thought intertwined with Islamic theology. Indian fables were translated into Arabic and retold in new forms. The Abbasids did not simply preserve cultures, they absorbed and transformed them. This fusion gave Islamic civilization its universal character. The Abbasids could stand as heirs to the Prophet, but also as patrons of Aristotle, Ferdowsi, and Indian storytellers. They did not see contradiction here. Instead, they saw opportunity, a chance to enrich the Muslim world with the best the wider world had to offer. A civilization expressed in beauty. In the end, the art, architecture, and literature of the Abbasids expressed something profound, a civilization confident in itself. The spiral minarets, the golden manuscripts, the endless stories, all reflected a society that believed it had something eternal to give. Even as political power waxed and waned, this cultural brilliance endured. Mosques still carry Abbasid designs. Poets still quote Abbasid verses. Scholars still study Abbasid histories. The Abbasids may no longer rule, but the beauty they fostered continues to rule hearts and minds across the world. Chapter 10: The House of Wisdom and the Age of Knowledge. If there is one legacy of the Abbasids that continues to echo across time, it is their devotion to knowledge. In their era, learning was not confined to dusty manuscripts or cloistered scholars. It was alive, debated in the streets, refined in palaces, practiced in workshops, and taught in mosques. The Abbasids transformed Baghdad into the beating heart of a global intellectual revolution. From the 8th to the 10th century, their empire became the crossroads where Greek philosophy, Persian medicine, Indian mathematics, and Arab astronomy met. What emerged was a culture that valued seeking knowledge as a sacred duty, in line with the Islamic tradition that the pursuit of knowledge is an act of worship. The birth of the House of Wisdom. At the center of this movement stood the Beit al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom. Established under Caliph al-Ma'mun in the early 9th century, this was more than a library. It was a vast institution for research, translation, and discovery. Scholars from across the empire, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Persians, and Indians, gathered here, united not by faith alone, but by the pursuit of truth. Manuscripts flowed into Baghdad from every corner of the known world. Works of Aristotle, Plato, Hippocrates, Euclid, and Ptolemy were translated into Arabic. Sanskrit texts on mathematics and medicine arrived from India. Persian works of astronomy and administration were copied and studied. The House of Wisdom became a bridge between civilizations, ensuring that the knowledge of the ancients would not be lost, but instead renewed. Translation and transformation. But the Abbasids did not simply translate, they transformed. Scholars critiqued, expanded, and corrected what they inherited. For example, the Indian numeral system was refined into what we now call Arabic numerals, including the revolutionary concept of zero. Greek medicine was developed further by Muslim physicians who tested and challenged ancient ideas. Al-Ma'mun even sent emissaries to the Byzantine Empire to acquire rare texts, and he famously sponsored debates between scholars of different schools, ensuring that Baghdad buzzed with intellectual energy. The House of Wisdom became not only a library, but a laboratory of the mind. Mathematics, the language of the universe. The Abbasids made mathematics a cornerstone of their civilization. Scholars like Al-Khwarizmi wrote works that introduced algebra. In fact, the very word algebra comes from his book Al-Jabr. His methods of calculation spread into Europe, where centuries later they would form the foundation of modern science and engineering. Geometry was advanced to solve problems in astronomy, architecture, and land measurement. Trigonometry grew as Muslim scholars calculated distances across the earth and mapped the heavens with astonishing accuracy. What they were doing was not abstract theory. It had practical uses, from determining the direction of prayer to building canals and mosques. Astronomy, charting the heavens. Under the Abbasids, astronomy flourished. Observatories were built in Baghdad and later in other cities. Scholars like al-Battani refined the measurement of the solar year, while others produced star catalogs that remained in use for centuries. These astronomers did not see a divide between faith and science. To them, studying the stars was a way of understanding God's creation. It was also vital for everyday life, to calculate prayer times, mark Ramadan and Hajj, and guide travelers across deserts and seas. One famous anecdote tells of Caliph al-Ma'mun commissioning astronomers to measure the circumference of the earth. Using simple tools and clever observation, they came remarkably close to the modern value, a testament to the ingenuity of Abbasid science. Medicine, healing the body. The Abbasid era also witnessed great advances in medicine. Hospitals, known as Bimaristans, were established in Baghdad and beyond, offering free treatment to all, regardless of wealth or religion. These hospitals had wards, pharmacies, and teaching facilities, making them precursors to modern medical institutions. Physicians like Al-Razi, wrote encyclopedias of medicine, distinguishing diseases such as smallpox and measles for the first time. Later, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, would compile the Canon of Medicine, a book that became the standard reference in Europe for over 500 years. Their approach combined observation, experimentation, and treatment, moving beyond superstition toward a rational, evidence-based practice. In many ways, the Abbasids laid the groundwork for modern medicine, philosophy, and theology. The House of Wisdom was not only about science, it was also a hub for philosophy and theology. The Abbasids inherited the works of Greek philosophers and wrestled with questions of reason, faith, and existence. Schools of thought such as the Mutazilites emphasized rationalism, arguing that reason and revelation could not contradict one another. Debates raged in Baghdad's halls, sometimes spilling into politics. Caliphs like al-Ma'mun promoted rationalist theology, while later rulers leaned back toward tradition. But the very fact that such debates were encouraged shows the intellectual openness of the age. Thinkers like al-Kindi, known as the philosopher of the Arabs, sought to harmonize Greek philosophy with Islamic belief. Later, scholars such as Al-Farabi and Ibn Rushd, Averroes, would continue this legacy, influencing both the Muslim world and Christian Europe. The global ripple effect. The Abbasid knowledge revolution did not stay within their empire. Through Spain, Sicily, and the Crusades, these works entered Europe. Translations of Arabic texts into Latin sparked the European Renaissance. Algebra, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, all carried the fingerprints of Abbasid scholars. It is no exaggeration to say that without the Abbasids' efforts, much of classical knowledge might have been lost forever. Instead, it was preserved, enriched, and passed on, a gift to humanity. Knowledge as worship. What made the Abbasid pursuit of knowledge so unique was its spiritual foundation. Seeking knowledge was seen as part of faith, a way of fulfilling the Prophet's command to seek knowledge even if it be in China. Learning was not separate from religion. It was a path to understanding God's creation and serving humanity. This mindset gave the Abbasid intellectual tradition its power. Knowledge was not hoarded, it was shared, debated, and put to use. In medicine it healed. In astronomy it guided. In mathematics it solved. In philosophy it questioned. In every case, it was tied to a higher purpose. The eternal legacy. The House of Wisdom may have fallen to time, destroyed in the Mongol invasion of 1258, but its spirit endures. Every time we use algebra, navigate with a compass, or consult medical science, we are walking in the footsteps of Abbasid scholars. Their legacy reminds us that civilizations rise not only through power and wealth, but through knowledge, and that the pursuit of truth can bridge cultures, faiths, and centuries. Chapter 11: Daily Life in the Abbasid Empire. When we think of the Abbasid Caliphate, it's easy to picture glittering palaces, bustling libraries, and great scholars debating in Baghdad. But what was life really like for the millions of ordinary people who lived under Abbasid rule? To understand the empire, we need to step out of the halls of power and onto the streets, markets, and homes of its people. The urban world, Baghdad, the round city. At the heart of Abbasid daily life was Baghdad, a city so remarkable that it became legendary across the world. Founded in 762 CE by Caliph al-Mansur, Baghdad was designed as a round city, with its great mosque and palace at the center, radiating outward in concentric circles. Within a century, it had grown into one of the largest cities on earth, with perhaps 1 million inhabitants. Its streets were crowded with merchants, craftsmen, students, poets, and travelers. The Tigris River brought goods from far and wide, silk from China, spices from India, furs from Russia, gold from Africa. Markets buzzed with activity, offering everything from fragrant perfumes to fresh fruit, rare manuscripts to finely woven carpets. For an ordinary Baghdadi, the market was the heart of daily life. People haggled, shared news, listened to storytellers, and even attended public debates in open-air squares. It was a city of ideas as much as commerce, homes and family life. Most people lived in modest homes made of mud brick, with flat rooftops that served as sleeping quarters during hot summer nights. Wealthier families had courtyards with fountains, shaded gardens, and carved wooden screens for privacy. Family life was central. The household was often extended, including not just parents and children but grandparents, uncles, aunts, and cousins under one roof. Hospitality was a sacred duty, and guests were welcomed with food and drink, no matter the household's wealth. The role of women varied depending on class. Elite women sometimes had influence in court politics, while others were patrons of scholars and poets. In middle and lower classes, women contributed to family businesses, weaving, or trading in local markets. Clothing and appearance. Clothing was both practical and a marker of identity. Most men wore a long robe, or thob, with a turban or cap. Women wore long dresses and head coverings, though styles differed across regions of the vast empire. Fabrics ranged from simple cotton and wool to luxurious silks and brocades for the wealthy. Colors carried meaning. White symbolized purity and piety, while the Abbasid Caliphs famously wore black, both as a political symbol and as a marker of their dynasty. Perfumes and oils were common, as personal cleanliness was emphasized by Islamic teaching. Food and drink. The Abbasid Empire was a land of culinary richness. Bread was the staple, often served with stews, vegetables, or lentils. Dates, olives, figs, and pomegranates were common fruits. Meat, lamb, goat, chicken, and sometimes beef, was eaten by the wealthy, while fish was plentiful along the rivers. Spices from India and Persia added flavor to everyday dishes. Rice and sugar, though luxuries at first, became more widespread during the Abbasid era. Coffee had not yet been introduced, but tea and herbal infusions were enjoyed. And of course, water was central, carried from wells, aqueducts, or drawn from the Tigris and Euphrates. Feasting was part of Abbasid culture, especially at the Caliph's court, where banquets showcased exotic dishes, poetry recitals, and music. But even in humble homes, sharing a meal was an act of community and faith. Work and occupations. The Abbasid economy was vast and diverse. Farmers worked the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, using irrigation canals that traced back to ancient Babylon. Craftsmen produced pottery, glassware, textiles, and leather goods. Traders carried goods across the empire's immense trade routes, from the Mediterranean to India, from Africa to Central Asia. In cities, there were scribes who copied manuscripts, teachers who ran schools, and physicians who treated patients. The Abbasid system created space for upward mobility. A talented scholar, poet, or merchant could rise in status through skill and patronage. At the same time, slavery existed, though in a different form from modern times. Enslaved people worked in households, agriculture, or as soldiers, but some could gain freedom and even rise to prominence. The empire's diversity meant enslaved people came from many lands, including Turkic regions, Africa, and Eastern Europe. Education and religion. Education was highly valued. Children learned to read and write, often beginning with the Quran. Mosques doubled as schools, where teachers instructed students in religious and secular subjects alike. Wealthier families hired private tutors, while others joined circles of learning in marketplaces and libraries. Religion infused daily life. The call to prayer echoed across the cities 5 times a day. Fridays brought congregational prayer and sermons. Ramadan was marked with fasting, nightly prayers, and feasting after sunset. Pilgrimages to Mecca united people from across the empire, binding diverse cultures together under a shared faith. Entertainment and leisure. Despite the emphasis on learning and work, leisure was not forgotten. People gathered in coffee houses, introduced later, but early versions of tea houses existed, gardens, or private salons. Poets recited verses, musicians played the oud and flute, and storytellers performed tales like 1001 Nights, many of which took shape during the Abbasid era. Chess, imported from India and Persia, became a favorite pastime, played by scholars and soldiers alike. Falconry, horse racing, and polo were popular among the elite. For children, simple games with stones and toys filled the streets with laughter. A cosmopolitan empire. What set Abbasid daily life apart was its diversity. Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba were home to Arabs, Persians, Turks, Berbers, Africans, Greeks, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. Markets rang with a dozen languages. and neighborhoods reflected different cultures living side by side. This mix enriched daily life. New foods, fashions, and ideas blended, creating a cosmopolitan society that was both deeply Islamic and vibrantly global. The Abbasids presided over an empire where difference was not just tolerated but often celebrated, as long as loyalty to the state was maintained. Life's fragility. Yet life was not without hardship. Disease, poverty, and famine struck at times, reminding people of life's fragility. Political unrest could turn cities into battlegrounds. For the poor, survival was a daily struggle. And while the Abbasid age produced marvels, it also carried inequalities that weighed heavily on many. Still, through faith, family, and community, ordinary people endured, and it was their labor, creativity, and devotion that sustained the great achievements of the Abbasid age. The pulse of a civilization. In the end, the Abbasid story is not just the story of caliphs and scholars. It is the story of millions of men, women, and children who built, prayed, ate, dreamed, and worked under their banner. Their daily lives, humble and grand, joyous and difficult, gave the Abbasid Caliphate its pulse, its energy, and its humanity. To walk the streets of Baghdad, Cairo, or Cordoba was to feel the hum of life at its fullest, a rhythm that carried the empire through centuries. Chapter 12. Art, Architecture, and Culture under the Abbasids. The Abbasid Caliphate was not only a political and intellectual powerhouse, it was also a cultural crucible, where art, architecture, and literature reached new heights. Across the empire, creativity flourished in ways that expressed both faith and worldly beauty, blending influences from Persia, Byzantium, India, and beyond. Architecture, monumental and symbolic. Abbasid architecture reflected power, spirituality, and innovation. Beyond the famed round city of Baghdad and the spiral minaret of Samarra, the Abbasids experimented with mosques, palaces, and civic buildings that combined function with grandeur. Mosques incorporated large courtyards, arcades, and domed prayer halls, creating spaces for both worship and community gathering. Their designs were often geometric and symmetrical, reflecting a sense of cosmic order. Minarets, sometimes towering hundreds of feet, served as both practical structures for the call to prayer and symbols of spiritual aspiration. Palaces, on the other hand, displayed luxury and status. Marble floors, mosaics, gilded decorations, and expansive gardens reflected the wealth and cosmopolitan taste of the caliphs. Even in private homes of the elite, woodwork, ceramic tiles, and painted murals expressed artistry intertwined with daily life. Calligraphy and ornamentation. In a society where depictions of humans and animals were restricted in religious contexts, calligraphy became the supreme art form. The Quran was copied with painstaking precision, turning the written word into an aesthetic experience. The Kufic script dominated early Abbasid manuscripts with its bold, angular strokes. Later, more fluid styles emerged, often accompanied by arabesques and geometric patterns. These designs adorned mosques, palaces, manuscripts, and everyday objects, from ceramics to textiles. Art and devotion became inseparable. Literature, poetry, storytelling, and learning. The Abbasids elevated literature as much as architecture. Poetry became a public art, performed in courts, marketplaces, and salons. Poets like Al-Bunuwas wrote playful, satirical, and even risque verses, while others explored themes of philosophy, piety, and love. Prose flourished as well. Storytelling became central to culture. The 1001 Nights, though developed over centuries, took its most famous form in the Abbasid era. These stories reflected not just imagination, but the cosmopolitan, trade-connected, and multicultural society of Baghdad, Cordoba, and other great cities. histories and encyclopedias also emerged, blending narrative with scholarship. Writers like Al-Tabari chronicled both sacred and worldly events, preserving knowledge for generations. This literature was a bridge, linking the past with the present, connecting Baghdad with the wider world. Science, art, and daily life intertwined. Abbasid art was not isolated from science or philosophy. Astronomical instruments were beautifully decorated, medical texts were illustrated with precision, architectural proportions reflected mathematical knowledge. The pursuit of beauty and the pursuit of knowledge were deeply intertwined. Even everyday objects were works of art. Ceramics, glassware, textiles, and metalwork carried intricate patterns, colors, and inscriptions. A simple cup or lamp could reflect the era's sophistication, turning utility into elegance. Cultural fusion. What makes Abbasid culture extraordinary is its fusion of influences. Persian gardens informed urban planning and palace design. Greek philosophy inspired theologians and poets. Indian numerals transformed mathematics. African and Turkic artistic motifs enriched textile and ceramic design. This blending produced a culture that was uniquely Islamic yet universally appealing. Abbasid art and literature were both local and global, religious and worldly, intellectual and aesthetic. Education, patronage, and performance. Courts were not only political centers, they were cultural hubs. Caliphs patronized scholars, poets, musicians, and artists. Salons and palaces allowed philosophers to debate, poets to recite, and musicians to perform. Public spaces hosted storytellers and performers, ensuring that culture reached all levels of society. This commitment to patronage made Baghdad and other cities magnets for talent. Artists and scholars migrated across the empire, drawn by opportunity and recognition. In doing so, they spread Abbasid cultural values far beyond the capital. Enduring legacy. The cultural achievements of the Abbasids left a lasting mark on Islamic civilization. Calligraphy, geometric art, architecture, and literature established visual and intellectual languages that persisted for centuries. From Spain to India, traces of Abbasid artistry and taste can still be seen today. Their culture reminds us that an empire's greatness is measured not only by its armies or wealth, but by its ability to enrich the human spirit, to create beauty that lasts, and to cultivate minds that illuminate the world. Chapter 13: Political Challenges and Internal Struggles of the Abbasids. The Abbasid Caliphate's early centuries were marked by remarkable achievements in culture, science, and governance. But even at its height, the empire faced internal pressures that would eventually test its stability. To understand the Abbasid story, we must explore the political challenges, rivalries, and struggles that quietly undermined their power. The challenge of succession. One of the earliest and most persistent problems for the Abbasids was succession. Unlike some dynasties with rigid rules, Abbasid succession was often ambiguous. The death of a caliph did not guarantee a smooth transfer of power. Brothers, sons, and other relatives frequently vied for the throne, sometimes resorting to civil war. The most famous early example occurred after the death of Harun al-Rashid. His sons, Al-Amin and Al-Mamun, fought a bitter civil war known as the Fourth Fitna. Baghdad itself was besieged and scarred by battle. Al-Mamun eventually emerged victorious, but the conflict exposed deep fault lines within the empire, setting a pattern for future instability. Provincial autonomy and fragmentation. The Abbasid Empire was enormous, stretching from North Africa to Central Asia, and controlling it from Baghdad was increasingly difficult. Governors, tribal leaders, and military commanders often acted independently, collecting taxes and maintaining armies without central oversight. In some cases, provinces became effectively autonomous. In Egypt, North Africa, and parts of Persia, local dynasties emerged, recognizing the Abbasid Caliph in name only. While these regions often contributed taxes or military support, the caliph's direct influence waned. This decentralization was both a practical necessity and a sign of weakness. It allowed local cultures and governance systems to flourish, but it also eroded the unity and authority of the central government. Military challenges. The Abbasids relied on diverse armies, often composed of mercenaries and slave soldiers known as ghilman or mamluks. While these troops were highly effective, they created a problem. The army often held the real power behind the throne. Caliphs had to balance competing factions to prevent mutinies or coups. Revolts were common. Tribal uprisings in the deserts, Kurdish and Turkish incursions in the east, and Shura rebellions in southern Iraq and Persia demanded constant military attention. Each rebellion drained resources, diverted attention from governance, and sometimes destabilized the capital itself. Economic strains. The Abbasid economy was initially robust, fueled by trade, agriculture, and taxes from a vast population. But as the empire expanded and decentralized, administrative inefficiencies and corruption began to strain the treasury. Lavish court expenditures, palaces, gardens, libraries, and patronage of scholars and artists were expensive. When combined with the costs of military campaigns and maintaining bureaucracies across distant provinces, financial pressures mounted. These economic strains often hit the common people hardest, contributing to unrest in cities and rural areas alike. Baghdad remained a center of wealth, but its prosperity increasingly depended on trade and tribute from regions beyond the caliphate's direct control. Religious and factional tensions. The Abbasids came to power claiming legitimacy as guardians of Islam, but religious disputes were never far from politics. Various groups, Sunni, Shura, Kharijites, and others, sometimes rebelled or demanded autonomy. The Mu'tazilite philosophical movement, patronized by al-Mamun, sparked controversy by promoting rationalist interpretations of Islam. Later caliphs reversed these policies, but debates over theology often intertwined with politics, making religious authority a double-edged sword. Factionalism also extended to court politics. Powerful families, viziers, and military commanders competed for influence, occasionally bringing Baghdad itself to the brink of crisis. The caliph's ability to manage these factions often determined the survival of his reign. The seeds of decline. By the late 9th century, the Abbasid Empire faced a combination of internal weakness and external pressures. Provinces were semi-independent, the treasury was strained, military loyalty was uncertain, and the caliph's authority was increasingly symbolic. Yet, even amid these challenges, the empire's cultural and intellectual achievements continued to flourish. Baghdad remained a center of learning, science, and art. Scholars, poets, and architects carried forward the Abbasid legacy, even as the empire's political cohesion weakened. In many ways, the Abbasid story illustrates a paradox. Great civilizations can shine brightest even while their political structures falter. The caliph's authority was contested, but their cultural, intellectual, and spiritual influence endured across centuries. Reflection. The internal struggles of the Abbasids remind us that empire is never static. Succession disputes, provincial autonomy, military challenges, economic pressures, and factionalism were all natural consequences of ruling such a vast, diverse domain. The Abbasids' ability to maintain cultural brilliance despite political instability is perhaps their most remarkable achievement. It shows that the spirit of a civilization, its art, science, and literature, can outlive the challenges of kings, wars, and borders. Chapter 14. The Rise of Regional Dynasties and the Fragmentation of the Abbasid Empire. As the 9th and 10th centuries progressed, the Abbasid Caliphate faced an unavoidable reality. centralized control over its vast empire was slipping. While Baghdad remained the symbolic heart of the caliphate, new powers were rising in distant lands, each carving out its own sphere of influence. The emergence of autonomous dynasties. Across the empire, provincial governors and local rulers gradually assumed independence. Many of these leaders still nominally recognized the caliph in Baghdad, but in practice, they acted with complete autonomy. In Egypt, the Tulunid dynasty, 868 to 905 c, established an independent state. Ahmad ibn Tuluin built the city of Al-Qadai, complete with mosques, palaces, and markets. His rule demonstrated that a distant province could sustain its own administration, military, and cultural life without relying on Baghdad. In North Africa, the Aghlabids, 800 to 909 c, consolidated power in Afriqiya, modern Tunisia. They maintained Abbasid allegiance in name only, while cultivating trade networks across the Mediterranean and sponsoring architecture and learning. In Persia, the Samanids, 819 to 999 c, rose to prominence, promoting Persian culture, literature, and coinage, even as they acknowledged the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. They became patrons of Persian poets like Radaki, blending Persian identity with Islamic governance. In Central Asia, the Saffarids and later the Ghaznavids established military and administrative independence, controlling trade routes and building their own centers of learning. These regional dynasties were not merely rebels. They were capable rulers who managed economies, built cities, patronized scholars, and defended their territories. In many cases, they carried forward Abbasid traditions of governance, religion, and culture, even as the caliph's political power diminished. The caliphate as a symbol. Despite the political fragmentation, the Abbasid Caliph remained a spiritual and symbolic figure for the Muslim world. Coins continued to bear his name, Friday's sermons invoked his authority, and local rulers sought his recognition to legitimize their own rule. This symbolic power allowed the caliphate to retain cultural and religious significance, even when actual political control had waned. Baghdad remained the heart of Islam, the spiritual anchor connecting disparate lands and dynasties. Challenges from within. The rise of regional powers was partly a response to internal weaknesses in the Abbasid state. The central government struggled with military dependence on mercenaries and slave soldiers, who sometimes overpowered caliphal authority. Fiscal strains due to extravagant spending and declining revenue from distant provinces. Succession disputes that left the capital vulnerable and encouraged ambitious governors to act independently. As local dynasties gained autonomy, the empire fragmented politically, but culturally and religiously, the Abbasid influence remained a unifying force. Cultural continuity amid political fragmentation. Even as governors became independent, Abbasid culture spread through their courts. Architecture, literature, scholarship, and religious institutions maintained continuity across the empire. For example, the Samanids in Persia promoted Persian literature under the Arabic Islamic framework, while the Tulunids in Egypt built mosques and palaces reflecting Abbasid aesthetics. Trade, scholarship, and the shared Islamic legal system kept the empire culturally cohesive, even as political unity dissolved. Chapter 15. The Decline and Fall of the Abbasid Caliphate. By the 11th century, the Abbasid Caliphate had entered a period of prolonged decline. Political power had fragmented, regional dynasties dominated vast swaths of territory, and Baghdad's authority was largely symbolic. Yet even amid this decline, the Abbasids remained central to the Islamic world, as spiritual leaders, patrons of learning, and symbols of legitimacy. Erosion of political power. The Abbasid caliphs faced decades of weak leadership, court intrigues, and military dependency. The Caliph's armies increasingly relied on slave soldiers, mercenaries, and Turkish generals, who often wielded more power than the rulers themselves. By the 10th century, Baghdad was surrounded by governors and military commanders who acted independently, leaving the caliphs to manage the capital while struggling to influence distant provinces. Even within Baghdad, political assassinations, palace coups, and factional infighting were common. This erosion of central authority weakened the empire's ability to respond to external threats and maintain economic stability. Tax collection became inconsistent, infrastructure fell into disrepair, and unrest occasionally flared in cities and rural areas. The rise of new powers. As Abbasid control weakened, new powers emerged on the empire's peripheries. The Seljuk Turks arrived in the 11th century, restoring some order in Baghdad while effectively controlling the caliph politically. In Egypt, the Fatimids established a rival caliphate, claiming both religious and political legitimacy, challenging Abbasid spiritual authority. In the east, local dynasties like the Ghaznavids and Buyids dominated Persia and Central Asia, controlling taxes, armies, and trade. While these new powers maintained Abbasid symbolic authority in name, they demonstrated that political control had shifted. The caliph remained revered, but his influence was increasingly ceremonial. Cultural and intellectual persistence. Despite political decline, Baghdad remained a hub of knowledge and culture. Scholars, poets, mathematicians, and physicians continued to thrive, and the caliphate's symbolic authority ensured patronage of the arts and sciences persisted. The libraries, schools, and observatories founded by earlier caliphs continued to function, even under diminished political oversight. Baghdad still attracted intellectuals from across the Islamic world, sustaining the empire's reputation as a center of learning. Economic challenges. Economic decline paralleled political fragmentation. Trade routes were disrupted by instability in peripheral regions. Agricultural production suffered from neglect of irrigation systems. Heavy taxation in some areas caused resentment among peasants, while other provinces evaded central authority entirely. The empire's wealth became concentrated in Baghdad and a few major cities, leaving vast rural areas underdeveloped. Economic disparity fueled further unrest and weakened the caliphate's ability to mobilize resources for defense or infrastructure. The Mongol threat. The final blow came in the 13th century with the Mongol invasions. Under Hulagu Khan, the Mongols swept through Persia and Mesopotamia with unparalleled speed and ferocity. In 1258 CE, Baghdad fell. The city was sacked, palaces and libraries destroyed, and tens of thousands of inhabitants killed. The Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mustasim, was executed, ending the Abbasid Caliphate as a political power in Baghdad. The destruction of Baghdad marked a cataclysmic moment in world history. The heart of a centuries-long intellectual and cultural empire had been obliterated. The House of Wisdom and countless manuscripts were lost, extinguishing a treasure trove of human knowledge. Abbasid continuity in Cairo. Although the Caliphate in Baghdad ended, the Abbasid dynasty survived symbolically in Cairo under the protection of the Mamluk Sultanate. Here, caliphs continued to exist as spiritual figureheads, legitimizing rulers while wielding no real political power. This arrangement persisted for centuries, showing that while empires fall, the spiritual and cultural legacy of a dynasty can endure. Even in symbolic form, the Abbasids influenced Islamic law, ritual, and tradition. Reflection. The fall of the Abbasids demonstrates the fragility of political power. Even a dynasty that ruled one of the most remarkable empires in human history could crumble under military pressure, economic strain, and internal division. Yet their cultural, scientific, and intellectual achievements survived far beyond the collapse of their rule. From mathematics and astronomy to literature, philosophy, and art, the Abbasids left a legacy that shaped civilizations for centuries. The story of the Abbasids is therefore one of both rise and resilience. Political power may fade, cities may be destroyed, and dynasties may end, but the contributions of a vibrant civilization continue to resonate across time and space. Chapter 16: The Legacy of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasid Caliphate may have fallen as a political power, but its legacy has endured across centuries, shaping the Islamic world and leaving an indelible mark on global civilization. From science to art, literature to governance, the accomplishments of the Abbasids continued to resonate long after Baghdad's streets lay in ruins. Scientific and intellectual influence. The Abbasids' most enduring contribution is perhaps their promotion of knowledge and scholarship. Through institutions like the House of Wisdom, they preserved, translated, and expanded upon the works of Greek, Persian, Indian, and earlier Arab scholars. Mathematics, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, and the use of Arabic numerals spread through the Islamic world and into Europe. Figures like Al-Khwarizmi influenced European mathematics centuries later. Astronomy, observatories, star charts, and astronomical tables shaped navigation and calendar systems across civilizations. Medicine, the works of Al-Razi and Ibn Sina became standard references in both the Muslim world and Europe for hundreds of years. By fostering an intellectual culture that valued inquiry and experimentation, the Abbasids created a foundation for the Renaissance in Europe. Scholars in Spain and Sicily translated Arabic works into Latin, transmitting centuries of knowledge that would ignite scientific and philosophical revolutions. Cultural and artistic legacy. Abbasid contributions to art, literature, and architecture endured far beyond the empire's political decline. Calligraphy and manuscript illumination influenced Islamic art for centuries. The beauty of Arabic script, developed during the Abbasid period, became central to the aesthetic of mosques, palaces, and public works across the Muslim world. Architecture. The design principles of Abbasid mosques, minarets, and palaces inspired later Islamic architecture in North Africa, Spain, and India. The geometric and arabesque motifs they popularized remain iconic. Literature. Stories like The Thousand and One Nights, poetry, and philosophical texts preserved the richness of Abbasid intellectual life and inspired writers and thinkers far beyond Baghdad. Even as political control fragmented, these cultural achievements traveled across regions, influencing Cairo, Cordoba, Samarkand, Delhi, and beyond. Political and administrative influence. The Abbasids also left a legacy in governance and administration. Bureaucratic structures they developed, including taxation systems, record-keeping, and provincial governance, influenced later Islamic and non-Islamic states alike. The Caliphate model demonstrated how spiritual and symbolic authority could coexist with decentralized political power. Later rulers, from the Ottomans to the Mughals, drew inspiration from Abbasid administration and the concept of the Caliphate. Even after their fall in Baghdad, Abbasid caliphs in Cairo served as legitimizing figures for rulers like the Mamluks, showing the enduring power of their symbolic authority. Intellectual cross-pollination. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Abbasid legacy is the fusion of cultures they achieved. By translating and building upon Greek, Persian, and Indian texts, they created a cosmopolitan intellectual environment. This cross-pollination influenced not just the Muslim world, but also Europe, where scholars like Averroes and Avicenna shaped medieval philosophy and medicine. Through this chain, the Abbasids indirectly helped spark the European Renaissance, demonstrating that ideas, once nurtured, can outlast empires and borders. Legacy in modern times. Today, the Abbasid Caliphate is remembered not only as a political entity but as a civilizational model. Their emphasis on knowledge, cultural sophistication, and cosmopolitan exchange continues to inspire historians, educators, and artists. Universities, libraries, and cultural institutions across the Islamic world trace intellectual traditions back to the Abbasids. Cities that were once provincial centers under their rule, such as Baghdad, Cairo, and Samarkand, remain symbols of the enduring Abbasid spirit. Reflection. The Abbasid story teaches a timeless lesson: empires may fall, but ideas endure. Political power is fleeting, cities can be destroyed, and rulers may pass into history, but the knowledge, culture, and innovation they foster can shape human civilization for centuries. From mathematics to medicine, architecture to literature, the Abbasids left a lasting imprint on the world. They remind us that the pursuit of knowledge, the cultivation of art, and the celebration of human creativity are perhaps the truest forms of legacy, far more enduring than armies or conquests. Chapter 17. Conclusion and Reflection. As we reach the end of our journey through the Abbasid Caliphate, it's clear that their story is more than the rise and fall of an empire. It is a story of human ambition, creativity, faith, and resilience, a civilization that shaped the world in ways both tangible and intangible. The Arc of the Abbasids. From their seizure of power in 750 CE, the Abbasids transformed the Islamic world. They moved the capital to Baghdad, building a city that became the beating heart of culture, learning, and trade. Under their rule, science, philosophy, and art flourished. Knowledge was preserved, expanded, and shared across continents. But their history also reminds us that political power is fragile. Succession disputes, provincial autonomy, economic strain, and military dependency slowly eroded their authority. By the 13th century, the Mongol conquest of Baghdad marked the end of Abbasid political control, a dramatic and tragic conclusion to centuries of brilliance. Yet, even in decline, the cultural, scientific, and spiritual legacies of the Abbasids endured, transcending politics, geography, and time. Lessons from the Abbasids. The Abbasid Caliphate teaches several enduring lessons. Knowledge is power, but also lasting influence. Their dedication to scholarship, libraries, and education allowed their civilization to outlive political instability. Cultural fusion enriches societies. By embracing diversity, Persian, Greek, Indian, Arab, the Abbasids created a cosmopolitan empire where ideas and art could flourish. Symbolic authority can outlast political control. Even after Baghdad fell, the Abbasid Caliphate survived in Cairo as a spiritual and legitimizing institution. Human creativity is the true measure of a civilization. Architecture, poetry, science, and art are what make a society remembered across centuries. The Abbasids and today. Walking through modern Baghdad, Cairo, or Samarkand, we see traces of the Abbasid legacy: streets, mosques, libraries, and scholars' traditions that echo centuries of history. Their story reminds us that civilizations are built not only by rulers or armies but by thinkers, artisans, merchants, and everyday people who contribute to knowledge, culture, and community. The Abbasids showed that even amid political upheaval, the pursuit of knowledge, the creation of beauty, and the preservation of human experience endure. These achievements are timeless, connecting us with the past that continues to inspire the present. Final reflection. As we close this exploration, imagine the streets of Baghdad at its height, scholars debating in the House of Wisdom, poets reciting verses in marketplaces, craftsmen shaping beautiful objects, families gathering in courtyards, and travelers bringing news from distant lands. That world, though long gone, lives on in the ideas, art, and knowledge we still use today. The Abbasids remind us that civilizations are remembered not for their conquests, but for their contributions to humanity. So take a moment to reflect. In a world of constant change, what will we leave behind? knowledge, creativity, and culture, these are the legacies that endure. The Abbasids built a civilization that proves this truth, and through their story, we are inspired to do the same. Closing note for the audience. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, a quick like or subscribe helps us continue to explore these stories. And I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Drop your location and the time in the comments. Thank you for walking through the streets of Baghdad, the halls of learning, and the courts of caliphs with me. The Abbasid story is now a part of yours, and their legacy continues through each of us who values knowledge, culture, and human achievement. Thank you for watching and joining me on this journey through the Golden Age of Islam. I'll be sharing more inspiring and educational content like this regularly, so make sure to subscribe and hit the like button to support the channel. Your support helps push this knowledge to more people, and together we can continue to learn, reflect, and be inspired. May Allah bless you all.